You are watching TFI.
Greetings, welcome to this Autodesk Vred tutorial where we're going to go through the basics of getting started with Vred, just enough to a point where you can bring some data in, navigate around Vred, prep a scene, and then generate an image. I've seen a few people that have attempted to do this themselves and they've got very stuck very quickly because it's not the easiest of programs to get your head around, especially if you've got knowledge in another 3D CAD application which has a completely different sort of input method. So that's what we're going to be doing in here. Now I was going to set the video up for a second before we get started. Everything that you need to follow this will be linked in the description. There's going to be also a link to download a trial copy of Vred which will run for 30 days. And it'll give you either the option to go with Vred Design or Vred Professional. As of today, Vred comes in two different flavors. Vred Design is like Vred Lite. Vred Professional is the full version of Vred. But it is very expensive. If you were considering buying it, Vred Professional is out of the reach of most smaller companies, whereas Vred Design is quite reasonable, really. And everything I'm going to show you should be available in both versions. Also, I'm using Vred 2019.3, which as of today is the current subscription update, which introduces some new features into Vred. I'm not going to show those because if you download the trial, you'll only get access to 2019.0. So I don't really want to show any functionality that you won't be able to get at in the trial. However, in 2 or 3 months' time, as of recording, the next version of Vred will come out, which will have those features in it. So there's never really a right time to do these kind of videos, but that is what it is. Right, so in the description of this video, you'll see a couple of downloads. You'll have the Autodesk Vred download itself. You'll have a jet engine model download, and also an environment download. If you can get all those brought down, that'll be great. Now, the reason I'm going with the jet engine model, which should come down as a zip file, just do an extract here, and that'll unpack it as needed. I wanted to use a car of some kind. It'd be a bit more exciting if I was to do that. However, a lot of the car models available on the internet, they're someone else's work, and they're available for sort of non-commercial purposes. Even though this technically isn't a commercial video, I just don't want to go there, and I just wanted to avoid using someone else's car and potentially get myself into some trouble. But the jet engine model is an Autodesk model. It's a sample file, and it's available for anyone to download and do what you want with. So we'll bring that and extract that onto the desktop. The other file is this file here, which is a studio environment, and that's where we're going to start in Vred. So let's get going, mate. This is Autodesk Vred Professional at its absolute default. I've reset it back to factory settings, so you should be seeing what I'm seeing. If not, you should go and edit preferences and then just load all defaults down here. Click apply, and that should set your interface and all the options back to default. So I'd just like to do some things first before I get cracking. Also, bear in mind that I am completely 100% self-taught on Vred. I've not had a day's training on it in my life, and I've only been using it for roughly about a year to a year and a half. So there'll be some things that I do that a Vred expert might go, it's a bit weird, why did you do that? I'm like, well, I haven't been trained on it, but it works, it's fine. It's one of those programs where you can make your own way with it. As long as the end result, which is generally a visualization, looks okay, then it kind of doesn't matter really in some instances. But what I like to do, I'll turn off the scene plate manager. I don't know why, it's just this glowing button in the middle of the toolbar, and I just don't like to see it, so I'll turn it off. I know what it does, we'll cover that a little bit later on. But I don't like, right, holding down the left mouse button and then moving the mouse around will spin the environment around. Now if you use the middle wheel to scroll out, this is what we're looking at here. Press the middle wheel to pan, left mouse button is an orbit. But we're looking at this sort of dome environment. And I just don't, it's fine. I'm just not a fan of it. I prefer to use the one that I've given you, which I'll not say where it's from. Some people probably can guess, but you select this button here for materials, and you'll see 3 entities in the materials editor. We've got environments, shadow, and studio. All right, also turn on graph at the bottom here. Expand environments, expand studio, and you'll see a dome and a shadow plane. Right, so this is sort of the start of explaining how Vred manages its environments and its entities. Right, turn on wireframe and then scroll out. All right, just pan this out so it's to this side here. So I'm working with 1920 by 1080 here, so there's a small amount of screen space here. But if you select dome, right, the dome is the environment. The shadow plane is it's kind of the floor. It's a plane that Vred uses to cast shadows on for the floor. This material here has been applied to that plane. So if you were to select this entity here and then increase the occlusion intensity, for example, all the shadows that are cast onto that plane will be darker. You can, if you want to, create a new material and apply it to the shadow plane. So you have a wood texture or a stone or a tile texture on the floor. You can do that and it won't use that texture anymore. We've also got two switches here. Well, we've got this one here which is called an environment switch. And then we've got the studio, which is the background. This confused me when I first started using Vred, but the way it goes is whenever you create a new environment, it can be a picture environment, like a picture of a train station or a picture of a field or something like that. It'll create those as extra environments. They're then all linked into here and you can switch between them. So say, for example, you can go create a new environment, a new skylight, for example, and that'll create this extra skylight as a tile. And then in environments, you can switch between using the studio and the skylight, for example. So that's why you've got this sort of duplication of environments, even though it's not really. Okay, right, so that's explaining the background. Now, what I want to do is create a new environment background using the download that I've given you. So if going back into Material Editor, we can either edit the studio one or we can create a new one. Now, I'm just going to create a new one. So we'll select the plus at the bottom, go to Create Environment, Create Sphere Environment. And that'll give you a browse dialog box where you can go to wherever you downloaded my studio environment from, select that, and then just click open. It'll create a new tile, call it studio environment, and it'll set that as the background. And then we don't really need to do much more with it. You can, if you want to, just start changing this, just zoom in so the camera's sort of inside the dome. I just prefer this. It brightens things up a little bit, and it's just got a better ambience to it. Now, if you want to, you can change, like, say, the white balance, for example. It's currently by default set to 6,504. If you change that to, say, 7,500, it just gives the background a slightly warmer feel to it. Or if you lower it down to, say, 5,000, it gives it a sort of cooler feel to it. But I'm going to change that to 7,500. We'll leave the rest of the settings as default, and then we can close that down. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is import the data set that we're going to use. So select Import on the toolbar. And then we're going to browse to the desktop, go to the Jet Engine Model folder, go into Workspace, and then select jet engine model. And all you need to do is import the assembly, because Vred has a kind of data engine built into it where it knows it's a top level assembly and it has referenced parts. And as long as they're all in the same folder, it should find them all right. And then for the import settings, we don't really need to change much here. You can change the number of parallel processors that it uses. Now mine's set to, I've got a 6-core processor, and 12 refers to the number of threads that it's going to use. I'm not sure why it dropped down to 4. For the rest of the settings, we can just leave them as default. Now, I like to say put on the ground and then center in the origin, and I also like to choose apply materials from the asset manager, although that very rarely works, and then select import. What that does, though, it'll look through the imported materials, and if there's a material in Vred with the exact same name, then it'll swap it out and use the Vred material. But when you're importing 3D CAD data like Inventor, the textures tend to come in with an RGB value, and Vred obviously doesn't have an equivalent material. But we're going to let that import, and I'll pick it up once it's done. Right, that's imported, but as you'll see, it's imported pretty much nothing. It looks absolutely empty. Now, I've made a mistake when I've imported. When I executed the import button, you might not have done this, although if you followed me click for click, you probably have. But when I executed the import, I had the shadow plane selected in the scene browser, and what it's done is it's imported the jet engine and placed it underneath the shadow plane node. So I want to just left click on the jet engine here and then drag that up to the root, and then that brings it down here. You can see it's now imported down here at the bottom. Okay, that's the data imported. The next thing we need to do is just prep the data. Vred is a bit of a marathon rather than a sprint. There's a lot of data preparation that needs to be done, which is arguably probably quite boring to a lot of people, but I actually enjoy it quite a lot. And one of the first things I like to do once the data has been imported is just get it to the right size, because the unit conversion sometimes is quite off. And the way I like to do that is I just enable the ruler up here on the toolbar and then just look at the units on the toolbar. It's quite hard to see them, but That there, that says 200. So these notches are looking like they're going up in increments of 100. So I can consider those to be millimeters, which they don't have to be. It's just 200 units. It's not really got any particular unit of measurement as such. You can consider it 200 inches if you wanted it to be. But I'm going to consider that to be 200 millimeters, which, given that it's a jet engine, that's quite wrong. So we need to scale this up by a factor of 10. So the way I do that is I select the node, which it already is in the scene graph, and then select this transform option down here. There's two transform options. You've got this one up at the top and then this one up at the bottom. If you select the one up at the top, it gives you a triad, which lets you kind of manually drag the scene entities around in sort of real time. But if you select the transform option down here, it brings up a dialog box which lets you type in a transform input to scale things up by a more accurate measurement. So we can, it's quite important to have the node selected here as well. We want to scale the entire object up rather than individual bits. You want to go down in the transform dialog box to the scaling area, and then providing that you've got uniform scaling ticked, just type in 10 to any one of these values and then press return, and that'll scale the object up by 10 or a factor of 10 in all directions. And there you go. Right, zoom out a little bit and you can see now that it's scaled it up by 10, but we're sort of getting a little bit dangerously close to this being bigger than the actual environment now. That's fine, we can sort that out later as well. I'm going to turn the ruler off because I don't need that anymore. But another thing you can see as well is that because it's scaled it up by a factor of 10, it's scaled it up sort of centrally. The base point was the center, so we're sort of hanging out underneath the environment. All you do then is just select this button here, put the object on the ground, and it'll do just that. It'll drop it on the ground. But we do need to scale the environment up because it's just way too small by the looks of it. So I'm going to select the studio environment and then do the same thing, scale the studio environment up by a factor of 2. And then that's pretty much all we need to do there. Okie dokie then. Right, I'm going to select the jet engine model again, and I want to flip it over because I don't like it standing upright. It looks a bit silly. So we're going to rotate it. Yeah, let's rotate it. We're going to rotate it by 90 degrees, but in which direction? Vred doesn't have, well, it does have an XYZ system, but I suppose it is quite similar to other CAD programs, but it doesn't show you where the axes are because I don't know. I actually don't know why it does. Maybe there's an option in the preferences to turn that on, but the way I do this is I turn on the transform triad, and then you can see red is always X, green is always Y, and Z is always blue. That's the same as other Autodesk CAD applications. So I want to flip it around 90 degrees, this axis here, which is the Y axis. So go to rotate, Y, type in 90, and there you go. It'll flip it around 90 degrees on the Y axis. And then the next thing I want to do is put it on the ground. But what I've noticed in practice attempts at this is when you select place this on the ground, for some reason, I don't actually even know why, but it doesn't properly put it on the ground. I think there might be some kind of work point or vertice or something like that within one of these parts that's making Vred believe that the extent of the model ends here when it actually doesn't. It ends there. So I need to drag this down manually, and this is where people start to get stuck and a little bit frustrated because they start grabbing the arrowheads and nothing happens. Yeah, well, that's one of the little quirks with Vred, is it's just not the same as other Autodesk applications. What you have to do is hold down the Shift key on the keyboard, keep Shift key held down, grab the arrowhead, and you'll see as you move the mouse over the arrowhead it turns to a different color. That means that it's going to be selected. So with the Shift key held down, grab the Z arrowhead and then just pull it down, and you'll start to see the object move down. And it's just kind of trial and error at this point as to when it's on the ground. It's not an exact science, Vred. It's not a build application. It's visualization, so everything is to a certain degree approximate. Now you can turn off wireframe if you want, and then when you grab this and move it down, you'll be able to see when the object starts to disappear underneath the floor. If you want to, that's just going to be letting it go around about there, I guess, and that's sort of roughly on the floor. And I'm actually quite happy with that. If you want to go a little bit further, you can change the transform to be a rotate transform. And the way you go about doing that is by pressing Shift and E on the keyboard, and that'll change the triad for the transform option to be a rotate, and then you can hold down shift again, grab the line on the Z rotation, sorry, that'll be the Y rotation, and then you can sort of rotate it around, and then you can maybe have the engine looking like it's sort of balancing on an axis like this, and then press shift and W, and that'll go back to move, zoom in, orbit around, and then you can maybe just pull it down. It looks like sort of the engine's, I don't know, maybe just balancing between that point and that point there. It's not quite right. You can see that point here is going through the floor before that point does, but you want that point and that point to sit on the floor or touch the floor at the same time. So it's just trial and error. Shift and E, rotate it around a little bit, shift and W, pull it up. That's a little bit closer. That's probably enough, I think. It's probably close enough. Okie dokie. Alright, that'll do for now. So we've scaled it, we've rotated it, we've moved it, and that's how you do it in Vred. If you want to move individual parts, you can turn wireframe back on, and then it's the same input method. You hold down the shift key, select an individual part, and then you can see the triad now moves to that part, and you can press shift, and then you can pull these individual parts around. If you want to select multiple parts, you can press shift, control, and then you can pick up multiple parts and use the triad to move those around. You've got options in the transform dialog box for moving where the triad's located. For example, if you want to rotate a part and say, for example, the triad's rotating it around the wrong point, well, then you've got options down here to move the rotation pivots to, say, the center of the object, and then it'll do a better job of rotating it around a more central point. So that's how you manipulate objects in Vred. It works. Once you get the hang of it, it does work, but it does take quite a while to get the hang of that. And in the browser as well, the tree structure, you can see all the parts that have been imported from the CAD application. It tries its best to keep the file names or the browser nodes to be something recognizable. So you can see ISO 10642 M6 by 25. That's an M6 by 25 bolt. So that's something that works quite well. Okay, right. What's next? Well, the next thing that I would tend to do is change the materials that have been imported from the CAD model, because it's retained the textures from the CAD application and they don't really look all that good. This is meant to be metal, that's meant to be red paint, and it just looks awful. Which is fine, because at the moment, the way Vred's handling things is you're looking at Vred rendering on the graphics card. This is called OpenGL based rendering. It's not the final render, so it kind of doesn't matter how it looks here, but it is still a fact that the textures, they're not great. They're not proper Vred textures, therefore they're not really going to interact with ray tracing very well. So the way I tend to do this is I'll go into materials, and then you'll see in the material editor now we've got a lot more materials than we used to. And I mentioned earlier that they would come in with RGB values. Well, that's these up here. I think that's RGB values anyway. If it's not, I don't know what it is. But surface style and then 3 values. And it doesn't really mean a lot. So what we have to do is swap these materials out with a Vred material. And there's a number of different ways you can do this. There's an easy way and there's a hard way. The hard way would be to select Scene at the top and then go to Vred's Asset Manager. If you expand the Asset Manager, make that a little bit bigger, expand Vred Example Assets, and you'll see that Vred comes with a very automotive central bunch of materials and textures. Well, materials and textures in Vred are the same thing, that you can use. So we've got car paints, we've got various different metals, we've got plastics, we've got glass, we've got a couple of different fabrics, but not a great deal. And then you can say, for example, go to Chrome. Let's move this one out of the way for a bit. Grab Chrome from the bottom here. This is a folder, by the way, organizing the textures. These are the actual textures here. Left click and then drag it onto an object, and that'll change that object to be Chrome, for example. The problem is that you've got the bolts, for example. There are potentially hundreds of bolts. You don't really want to be grabbing Chrome and dropping it onto every single bolt and then every single washer It might link them, depending on how the CAD model was constructed. It might link them all together quite well, but then again, it might not. So the way I tend to do this is I'll go to Enable Wireframe, make sure that's turned on. I'll select a bolt, for example. What that will then do, in the material editor, it'll highlight the material that the bolt is using. So that tells me that that there is supposed to be metal. It's supposed to be a shiny metal representing a bolt. So I'll right click on that texture and then I'll select nodes. That'll then select everything, every single object in the entire model that's supposed to be a shiny metal. I'll then come to the asset manager, find something that's a shiny metal, for example chrome, right click on it and then apply to the selected nodes. So it's going to apply chrome to everything that's now selected. And then boosh, there you go. Everything is now chrome. That's then made this material redundant. This is now still in the Vred scene, but there's nothing actually, it's not applied to anything. So if you select this button here, remove all unused materials, it'll purge out all of the materials that are now no longer in use. And as you keep doing this, you'll slowly eventually get rid of all of the textures that were brought in from Inventor, and everything will be assigned to a Vred texture. Okay, I've just noticed something as well. You can see there's some entities in the background here that are highlighted, but they're not actually visible. Now, what's happened here? For some reason, again, I don't know why, but Inventor had what's called a design view on the jet engine, and this half of the engine there was a toggle to turn it on and off, and Vred's imported that data turned off. So it's in the scene, but it's turned off. So what you want to do is just scroll up the top of the Vred tree structure scene graph, as they call it. You want to right click on that, and then you want to show hide all, and that should turn on. There's quite a lot of data there that wasn't actually turned on, but that turns everything on. Right, back to the material editor. So the next thing I'm going to do is just go through every single one of these textures and swap them out with a Vred texture. It's extremely tedious, but it's necessary. So we're going to start with the chassis of the engine. That's this one here, which suggests that kind of, I mean, I don't know what this is supposed to be. I don't know what the original engine was supposed to look like, but if we right click on this texture, select the nodes, this is generally just the body of the engine. So we can make this maybe like a hammered metal. So we can go to the top level folder for metals. We can go to aluminium hammered and then apply to the selected nodes. If we turn off wireframe, you can see what that's now starting to look like. So it's starting to come together a bit. If you find that the textures are maybe a bit too big, you want to scale them down a little bit, you do have the freedom to edit the textures that you've imported from Vred. So we can scroll up to the top, go to it'll be this one here, aluminium hammered, and it'll show you that the texture is read only. It's not changeable because it's a asset imported from Vred. It's a default read-only asset. Well, you can right-click on it, go to Asset, and then just remove the reference, and it'll sort of take away the read-only check mark on that material, and you're now free to change it. So we can go to, I don't know, bump texture, and we can increase the bump intensity. We can change that to 2, and it just gives a sort of deeper groove in the bump texture. And then we can go to brush orientation. I think that's, even though it's not a brush, it's a hammered appearance, but it's down as brush orientation, and we can change the size of the brush orientation from 5 down to maybe 2.5 by 2.5, and then that just reduces the size of that pattern there, so it's not so standout. If that's still a bit too big, you can drop it down to 2 by 2, and then just keep going until you're happy with it. Right, that's another texture done. Right, so this one's the red paint. Right click on that, select nodes, so it should highlight, turn on wireframe so it's easy to see, highlights the nose cone on the engine. That's, oh, we've got a couple of bodies here in the middle which are also red, and then this nose cone here. Alright, so we need to swap this out with a Vred red paint, so we can go back to car paints. You don't put metallic paint on an engine. It doesn't need to be metallic, but we can go to unicolor and then maybe just paint red or paint red dark. Right click on that, apply to selected nodes, take off wireframe so we can see what's happened, and that's what we've got. If you're not quite happy with that, you can go to Paint Red, apply it to selected nodes. Happy? No? Paint Low Coat Red, apply it to selected nodes. And you can just keep trying them as much as you want. Apply it to selected nodes and just stop when you're happy. That will have imported all of those paints into Vred, but of course it's only using one of them, so you can just purge them out once you're done with them all. Alright, there's a couple of tiles in here that are actually named Steel Mild, Steel Alloy. If you hold down Control, it'll let you multiple select them. All of these are supposed to be a steel texture. I suppose the nickel one is as well. As is aluminium and aluminium up here. Actually, one of those is aluminium hammered, isn't it? It's that one there, so I'm going to uncheck that one. So these 7 tiles are imported Inventor textures or Inventor materials, but they won't have come through really as a very good metal texture. They'll just be a flat colour. So we're going to right click on those, select those nodes. There's quite a few there actually, isn't there? Quite a few there. So this is all meant to be metal again. So we can go back into metal, go to aluminium polished, just to give it a bit of depth. We're going to have chrome polished, we're going to have aluminium polished, and then apply to selected nodes. And that applies aluminium polished to all of these parts. Bear in mind, a lot of parts are going to be internal within the engine. So you'll be changing some of the textures and you'll not see anything visually update. It's because a lot of the parts will be inside the engine. There is quite a lot of detail inside this model. Right, then we've got this black here, which I suspect is these ones here. Let's right click on that to select nodes. Okay, I don't know what that is. If you get to that point where you're selecting a material, select a node, and you don't know what it is, you can select isolate on the toolbar at the top, and it'll isolate what is using that texture. And then you can see there's a couple of internal parts. It actually doesn't even matter what these are. Just select isolate again to undo that. So I can select all of these, what should be black, select nodes, isolate. Okay, so we've got a mixture here of the fan blades and internal parts. I'm probably quite happy to just apply a black paint to all of those. So I can go to Car Paints, Unicolor, Paint Black, apply it to selected nodes. That'll give it a nice shine, proper paint texture, undo the isolate, and then just purge out those materials. Alright, so we've got another couple of materials in here to get swapped over. Now, a couple of them don't make much sense. One of them being titanium. Now, if I right-click on that and select nodes, it appears to be selecting absolutely everything, and I haven't quite figured out yet why it's doing that. So we're going to leave that one till the end. It's selecting some of the textures which have already been applied to, like aluminium hammered and whatnot. So we'll just leave that one alone for now. We'll go to generic, right-click, select nodes. And that's going to bring up some internal components. Let's isolate those and see. Yeah, they're just internal components. They look like there should be a metal, so we can go to, I don't know, aluminium matte, apply to selected nodes, and then we can purge out the generic material and unisolate those. If you're finding as well that you're not a fan of this this box that it puts around, this bounding box, you can just turn off boundings. I tend to regularly toggle between wireframe and boundings depending on what it is I'm doing, because I don't like it when it selects the environment and has it as a mesh, so I'll tend to change that to a bounding when I'm doing something with the environment, but you can just swap between the two of them. But it's better to have wireframe on when you're applying textures. It's a better selection identification. Right, so the rest of them, we've got aluminium hammered. These ones are all Vred materials. If they've got like the little V slash on them, that you know it's a Vred material. So we've got surface style, this one here. We can select the nodes on that, isolate them. More internal, well, a couple of internal parts, and we've got these sort of rods there. We'll make those a polished chrome, so we can go to chrome, apply it to selected nodes, and purge out that. Undo the isolate. Go to this one here. In fact, these ones look quite similar. That one's a slightly different shade, but these three here look like they're all cut from the same cloth. So we'll select those nodes and isolate them, and we'll see what we've got. Yeah, a couple of internal parts and a couple of bits of sheet metal on the outside of the engine. They look like they're going to be metal as well, so we'll make those aluminium polished, apply it to selected nodes, undo the isolate, and then purge them out. And then we've got these two here, which also look, I don't know, we'll do them separately. Let's not cheat. Let's not get lazy. Select the nodes, isolate. Alright, internal parts. Again, looks like metal. So I'm just varying. Basically, I haven't got a picture, like a reference picture to go off here. So I'm just making this up, and I'm varying the metal type that we're using. So we'll come down to, let's go into the metals folder, and we'll go with a different style of metal. Let's go with mercury brushed. Apply to the selected nodes. I think these are probably internal anyway, so I will not see these. Undo the isolate. Right click this one here. Select nodes. Alright, this is an external part and an internal, looks like another internal fan blade. Let's isolate those. Oh, there's a lot of them there, isn't there? Alright. Let's put these, because there's an external piece there. We can apply different textures here, but I'm just, for the sake of time, I'm applying a single texture to the entire node. But if you wanted to, you could go to, say, paint, and then just drag paint onto individual parts. But let's go to paint white and then apply to the selected nodes, and that will paint those. Most of these are internal anyway, and that's almost everything done except titanium, which is still a bit of a mystery to me. I'm not sure why it's selecting absolutely everything. Not a clue, mate, so I'm just going to leave that as it is. And that's as good as done with the paints. You can play with that as much as you want. Once you've brought in, say, red paint, for example, let's turn off wireframe, you can change the characteristics of any of these materials. You can go to paint red, right click asset, remove the reference, and you can change it to be something completely different. If you want it to be like a racing green color paint, and then just change that to paint green. It's entirely up to you. You can change the clear coat. It is an automotive package, so all of the textures are geared towards automotive, like clear coats and orange peel and flake size and flake intensity, that kind of stuff. But that's looking pretty good. It's looking pretty good. Right, the next thing I tend to do is make it look good in OpenGL. I just like doing this for reasons. But first, let's save it. We haven't done that yet, and we've done an awful lot of work. So let's go to the desktop, and we'll save this as Jet Engine. If we can spell engine right, that would be a good start. JetEngine.vpb. That'll save the scene off to the desktop. And it saves it pretty quickly. Actually, Vred's really good for saving data. And also, if it ever crashes, it'll always save your scene before it crashes out. Well, in most cases anyway, which other Autodesk teams could absolutely learn a thing or two from. Shots fired. But anyway, let's go up to the top of the scene graph. And let's minimize the jet engine node and work with the shadow plane on the studio environment. Another thing I've noticed, which someone from the Vred team is very welcome to pop into the comments and explain why, but I've noticed that as you're applying textures and just doing some general scene work, Vred often turns off the shadow plane. See this little tick in here? This turns the shadow plane on and off. Don't know why it does it, but let's turn it back on. So what we're going to do now is something called baking shadows. This is entirely for working in OpenGL. This does not affect ray tracing, but I like to have shadows turned on and baked into the environment. Baking the shadows is, so obviously at the moment there's no shadows at all. There's no shadows at all on the ground floor. There's no shadows inside the engine. Absolutely nothing. But I like to have those shadows on. So what Vred can do is it can take the lighting in the scene, which at the moment the lighting is only what's being cast off this environment. You see these light patches here. These are acting as lights on the scene. And it can take where the shadows would be and bake it into the objects. It's very CPU computationally expensive. Takes a little bit of time to do, but it makes it look really nice. So select the shadow plane. So we're going to start with baking the shadows onto the floor. Go to scene, bake lights and shadows, and we get this dialog box here where you can change the settings. But this is a beginner's tutorial, so I'm not going to go through all the settings. What I tend to do is go to settings here, load settings, and then car highest quality, which is fine when it's the ground plane. You can just go to ground plane low quality, but it usually doesn't take too much time at all to use the highest quality of shadows on the ground floor, and then select calculate all. What that's going to do is it's going to take the lights in the scene, and then where there's no light on the ground plane because it's obscured by the actual object itself, it'll bake the shadows onto that ground plane. This one here, shadow plane 2. So depending on the quality of your system, this might take 10 seconds, it might take 20 seconds, it might take 2 minutes. But on a system like mine, which is an 8700K, it doesn't take too long, and it's very subtle, but you get this sort of ambient shadow going on underneath the jet engine. Now, clearly there's a problem. There's a problem. We moved the jet engine down onto the floor when this section of the engine was turned off. So you can see that this is now underneath the floor. That's not good. We need to sort that out. So we need to do a bit of moving around. We need to do a bit of transforming. Right, and that also means we've got to turn the shadows off. We've got to delete the shadows that I've just computed. So select the shadow plane, and you can just select clear all. And that'll delete the shadows that it's just calculated. It's a bit of a waste, but never mind. Right, select the jet engine, transform, and then we can just hold down shift, pull this up, and we'll have to press shift and E, rotate it around again, shift and W. I've got my finger held down on the shift key pretty much perpetually. Shift and E, just rotate it very slightly, shift and W, and we'll just drop that down to about there. That'll do. It's sort of close enough for me, that is. Okay, select the shadow plane again, and we're gonna given how weak the shadows are, I don't think I need highest quality. Let's go back to ground plane low quality and calculate all, and that should calculate it in a matter of absolute seconds. There you go. And to most people, you're not really going to tell the difference, but it is just very slightly more grainy in the shadows, and you should be able to see them by just turning the ground plane on and off. You can see the kind of result that we've got. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is bake the shadows onto the objects themselves. This is optional, but it looks absolutely amazing once it's done. And there's two ways of doing this. You can either select the individual objects, and most Vred professionals will do this. They'll select the outer objects, holding shift and control, and they'll only bake shadows onto the objects that you can see. So in a car scene, for example, they'll bake shadows onto the bonnet, the fenders, the doors, the boot, and then maybe the visible objects inside the car, and then bake shadows onto just those objects. Else, it's wasted time baking shadows onto objects that you can't see, especially when you don't use what you're looking at right now as any final imagery. But I like to bake onto everything. I'm just playing around with this at home, so spending a bit of time waiting for it to do this isn't really the end of the world for me. So I can select the top node of the jet engine model, go to settings, load settings, and then this bit is entirely up to you. If you select car highest quality, it's probably going to take around 15 minutes to 20 minutes on an 8700K to bake all of these shadows on. But it's going to look amazing. The shadows are going to be really crisp, sharp, and deep. If you go to car low quality, it's probably going to do it in 5 minutes, but the shadows will be slightly blocky, not so good. So let's compromise and let's go with medium quality and then calculate all. And I'll pick this up when it's finished. Okay, that's just finished there. As it's finishing and it's ticked over 100%, you should see the shadows baked onto the object. If you turn off wireframe, you can see, oh, look at that. That looks absolutely amazing. But the shadows are a little bit blocky. They're not quite as good as they would be with the highest quality. If you prepare to sit and wait a while, then it's always best to do the highest quality shadows. It's just expensive in terms of time. But that makes your model look hell of a lot better. It looks pretty good. It's a bit devoid of colour a little bit as we've made the cone green, but that looks really nice. I'm well happy with that. Okay, we can turn off transform so we can get rid of the triad, and we're now kind of, I guess you're ready. We've textured this up. This is at a point now where we're ready to generate an image from it, but there are a couple of other things that you can do just to make it a little bit more customized, if you like. So we can turn off bake lights and shadows. We're done with that now. If you go back into materials, you can change the background. If you want to have a more realistic background, you can change that to a proper HDRI background. Vred does come with some standard kind of out of the box backgrounds, which they're okay, but they're not great. What I recommend, if you're able to get at this, is a website called HDRI Haven. This is an independent website. I'm not affiliated with them at all, but this guy, he accepts donations. Strongly suggest if you're into this kind of thing and you do like his HDRIs and you're going to use them commercially, just drop a couple of dollars into his Patreon fund. Don't know the guy, never spoke to him, but what he's done is amazing. But if you go to his HDRIs, you'll find a whole bunch of spherical imagery that you can download for free at an insane resolution and use them in your Vred environments. So a lot of these A lot of them aren't really applicable to something like a jet engine. You wouldn't drop a jet engine into a gym or a sauna environment, but maybe you'll find if you just hit more, have a browse through them, you might find a warehouse or like an open landing pad, for example, that you might drop an engine onto. Select this. You'll see what it's gonna, a good preview of what it's gonna look like, and then you can download the 4K or the 8K background, for example. And there's just so many of them, and they're very good quality. This one here is particularly good, a nice indoor garage scene, good for cars, good for some industrial objects that you might want to drop down. Select 4K or select 8K, download those. Once you've downloaded them, you can come into the Vred material editor. You can select new material or new environment, sphere environment, and then you can browse to wherever you've stored them. So I've downloaded a couple of them, which I've stored in a folder called HDR Backgrounds, HDR, and this is them all here. Windows does have a hard time caching the thumbnails of them because they're so big. Say 16K HDR background. Windows just doesn't, it's just naff really at storing the thumbnails. But say, for example, a garage background. I've got one called Skylit Garage 8K. Double click that one, and it'll generate a Vred spherical environment. It'll start off as a dome shape, but it's a spherical image based off of that HDR. You can change the environment geometry to be either, which at the moment is currently a dome, but you can change that to be a sphere. And we tend to not use, like, you can do, but it's sometimes not normal to use this as the actual background of a render. You'd actually use a scene plate rather than this. This just exists to cast reflections in light onto the engine, but that looks really good. It looks, if you want to see how it looks in comparison to the studio, you can flick backwards and forwards between the studio light, my custom one, and then the garage, and it's entirely 100% subjective as to which one you prefer. If you want to use the lighting and the reflection of that background but not have it actually show, you can tick or untick is visible, and then we can go to the Skylit Garage node in the scene graph, go to the shadow plane, and this is a different shadow plane to the one we baked the shadows onto earlier. Each environment has its own shadow plane, so you can go to scene, back into bake lights and shadows, go back to load settings, ground plane, low quality, calculate all, and it'll just add a couple of shadows onto that ground plane just to give it that realistic feel. And that looks really nice. Really liking the look of that. Okay, in terms of the background itself, you can just render this out if you want to, looking like that. That would be fine. But most Vred users tend to put what's called a scene plate into the background, and that's the button that I turned off at the very start of the video. So if you turn on scene plates, go into scene and then scene plate editor. It's better to use a photograph as a background rather than the HDR environment, because quite often the HDR environment can get warped, distorted as it's being wrapped around a sphere. It depends how it was taken and its proportion to the model. But for this environment, it's entirely up to you. But I go to, say for example, Google Images, do a search for plane hanger, go to Images, change the tools, size, larger than 4 megapixels, and for this scene I'm using this picture here. I can't include this in Dropbox because I don't own the photograph, but if you want to go to it yourself, that's on you. Right click this tile, go to save image as, and then just drop it onto the desktop. Now that's quite a high resolution photograph, which makes a huge difference. That's really important for this, that it is a high resolution photograph. You don't want a pixelated backplate on top of a pixel sharp render. Right, in here you want to select the plus at the bottom and you want to create a new backplate. Browse to the desktop, select the backplate that you've just downloaded from Google Images, and then that'll drop the photograph into the background of Vred's environment. You should see it there. If you want to, you can change the white balance of the background to match the HDRI to be slightly warmer or slightly colder, depending on what looks best for you. But we're not really doing a production image, so I'm just happy to leave it like that. That's fine with me. The next thing I would do is try and match the projection of the model to suit the backplate. What does that mean? Well, the field of view, the perspective angle that's being applied to Vred's camera might not match the photograph, and this is quite difficult to line up. So what I tend to do is go to the ground plane of the HDRI, turn on wireframe, and you'll see here that we get the ground plane extends there. It's like a line there and a line there. What you want to try and do, if possible, is make sure that these lines here align to a corner of a building in the photograph. So you can see here, if I move the camera up, this ground plane is angled off lower than the building. You want to try and line up that edge to that building edge and that edge to the opening of the hangar there. Might be easy, it might be very difficult. It's just depends on what you've got to work with. So to change that, we can go to cameras, select perspective, and we can change the field of view to be either lower or higher depending on what it is or how far out you are. So we can drag this down to say 30. You can just type in 30 there if you want to, and then we'll go back to the model, zoom out a bit and see if that's any better at lining up with the building. No, it's not. It's actually got worse, so I needed to increase that. I'm not very good at this kind of thing, so we'll change that to 60, and then we'll scroll out and then try and match it up. Nope, it's actually not made much of a difference at all, has it? It's a little bit closer, but it might just be that we'll not be able to get this to line up at all. It just entirely depends on what it is you've got to work with. That's a little bit closer. So yeah, for this scene, what I want to do is change the field. I just had to play around with it there just offline because it's something that I just need to do pretty quickly. So we're going to change the field of view to 80. Hold down the left and the right mouse button at the same time. Move your mouse to the left and right, and you'll be able to angle, just roll it as well. Because if you're finding that it's not quite working with the field of view, you might need to roll the camera to get it to be angled enough like that. So that's roughly, that'll probably do. I'm not a fan of this quite high skew on the model, but if that's what lines up with the projection of the photograph itself, especially if it's like a fisheye lens or something daft like that, then it has to be right, or else if the model looks out of skew with the background, it's just a clear giveaway that something's fake. Right, then we can go to image processing, change the tone mapper to Reinhard RGB, and we're going to change the color space to Aces. And that's enough for the camera for now, just to get us going. Turn off wireframe, and we're ready to knock out a render. So we need to just change a couple of settings to get it customized for us, I guess. We'll go to rendering, go to render settings, and then go to ray tracing quality. Currently we're looking at interactive with pre-computed and shadows. We're going to change that to full global illumination, and we're going to turn photon tracing on to indirect only. Change the trace depth down to, we'll change that down to 8. Use automatic photon radius, and in IBL sampling quality we're going to change still frame to 4. We're going to change reflection sampling quality to 4, and we'll leave the others at default. These are entirely customizable. These sliders go way up, 32, 64, upwards of those kind of values. But the higher you go, the longer it'll take to do a render, and you do get diminishing returns to a certain degree on some of the settings beyond a certain value. But there is no right settings for any of these, unfortunately. It's one of the things that kind of frustrated me when I first got going with it, is you change a lot of these settings, you'd have no idea what is actually changing with each of the settings, because there was diminishing returns past a certain point. But we can leave that as it is. Go to general settings, and we can change the anti-aliasing to use image samples. We can drop that down to 128. Use sharp triangle on pixel filter. We can leave the rest of those as they are. You won't have this setting here, denoiser, but this is where you can use deep learning on your GPU to reduce noise in real-time ray tracing. But if you've downloaded the trial of 2019, you won't have that, unfortunately, so I can't really go into that one. But we can turn that off, and now if you just enable ray tracing here, you should see a first pass of what this is going to look like, and that looks all right. Apart from the model looking slightly skewed here, which do you know what it is? I might just go against the background alignment and turn that off, and just reduce the field of view a little bit. I'm just not a fan of that kind of high degree of skewing going on. So I might just manually align this up so it looks a little bit better, something like that. Turn on ray tracing again. Yeah, that looks a lot better. Yeah, I didn't like that kind of skew on the photograph. Right, that's probably enough for me. The model's quite dim actually, so what we can do to increase the brightness on the model is go into materials, go to it's the skylight garage that's currently lighting our scene, and then we can increase the exposure on the scene to maybe 3, and the temperature, we'll leave that as default, and then enable ray tracing again. Yeah, that looks alright. That looks alright. I'm also not a fan of how shiny the body of the engine is, but that's the aluminium hammered texture that's applied to that. So to change that, you would just drag another texture on to that to enable ray tracing to see if you're happy enough with it. But there you go, mate. That's it. If you want to create the final render, you would go to enable anti-aliasing. That's where it now starts to go through all of the iterations of the ray tracing engine. It starts to clear up all the noise to create the final image, but this is still kind of interactive, and you won't get your final render with this. You go to render settings again, and then with all of these settings enabled, go to file output. We'll change this file name to be desktop. We'll change this file name to engine. For the image size, we'll go to, let's make this 4K. Let's go all the way 4K. Render mode, full global illumination, render quality. Let's go to production, and I think we're good to go, mate. Let's click render and then wait for this one to finish. Well, I think I'm going to wrap it up there. I've been waiting 45 minutes and it's only 39% of the way through, so it will have finished by the time I edit this, so I'll flash up the finished picture now. But I'm going to wrap it on the end there, mate, because I think that's enough to get you going. And if you're thinking, but you didn't talk about lights and how to make your own textures and stuff like that. This was just to get you started, get around the navigation, making a scene, that kind of stuff. This could be an entire day's worth of a video if it was to cover all of the bits and bobs inside of Vred. It's a massive program, and it's a case of where do you stop with something like this, and I think now is that point. So hopefully you found this useful enough to get you importing data and using that data. That's really what the goal of this was. So thank you for watching. Thank you to the person that gave me the idea for this. I read a comment from somebody who said they were using it within the manufacturing sector, and kind of gave me the idea that this is something which should be done on my channel, I think. So yeah, that'll do it for now, mate. Right, I'm knocking on the head there, as I said. See you later. Toodles.